We now arrive at the most powerful, most controversial, and most consequential of all the great Mughals. In the long and bloody saga of the Timurid dynasty, no figure is more complex or more polarizing than the sixth emperor, Aurangzeb. He was a man of devout piety who waded to the throne through the blood of his brothers, an austere ascetic who despised music and luxury, yet presided over the empire at its absolute wealthiest. He was the conqueror who pushed the empire's borders to their greatest extent, and in doing so signed its death warrant. He took for himself the title Alamgir, conqueror of the world, and for nearly 50 years, he would dedicate every waking hour to that purpose. History has judged him harshly, branding him a bigoted fanatic who systematically dismantled Akbar's legacy of tolerance and fractured the empire along religious lines. But is this the whole story? Or was he a man of stern principle, a brilliant but flawed ruler, forced into hard choices by the political realities of a vast and crumbling empire? Was he the poison that killed the Mughal state, or merely the doctor who diagnosed its fatal illness too late? Aurangzeb's story does not begin with his coronation, but in the crucible of the war for succession. This was not just a squabble between brothers over land and titles. It was a battle for the very soul of the Mughal Empire. On one side stood the heir apparent, Dara Shikoh, the mystic, the scholar, the translator of the Hindu Upanishads into Persian, the favored son who embodied Akbar's vision of a syncretic, harmonious culture. On the other side stood Aurangzeb, the orthodox, the Puritan, the battle-hardened general and champion of a stricter, more fundamentalist Islam. The choice between them was a choice between two vastly different futures for the subcontinent. While Dara held court in Delhi, Aurangzeb forged alliances and marched his veteran armies north. He was a far superior general and a more cunning politician than any of his brothers. He defeated Dara's forces at the Battle of Samugar in 1658, forcing him to become a fugitive. What followed was a chilling display of Aurangzeb's calculated ruthlessness. Dara was eventually betrayed and brought to Delhi in chains. He was dressed in rags, placed on a filthy elephant, and paraded through the streets of the capital city he was once meant to rule, a public humiliation of the highest order. A tribunal of conservative clerics convened by Aurangzeb quickly declared Dara an apostate from Islam. In August 1659, he was beheaded. It is said that Aurangzeb demanded the severed head be brought to him to confirm it was truly his brother. This was more than just fratricide. It was a statement. The execution of the mystic prince was a message to the entire empire. The age of religious experimentation was over. The era of tolerance was finished. Orthodox Islam was now the undisputed law of the land, and Aurangzeb was its unyielding enforcer. He had imprisoned his father, killed his brothers, and now he was the absolute master of Hindustan. The new emperor was a man of stark contrasts to his predecessors. Where Shah Jahan's court had been a theatre of glittering opulence, Aurangzeb's was one of austere piety. He himself lived the life of a near-monk, abstaining from alcohol and rich food. He learned the Quran by heart, and in his spare time he would meticulously copy out the holy book and sew prayer caps, selling them to pay for his own modest funeral. He was not a hypocrite. He lived by the rigid code he sought to impose on his empire, and that code would soon fall like an iron curtain across the subcontinent. Believing that the empire had strayed from the path of true Islam under the perceived heresies of his ancestors, Aurangzeb began a systematic reversal of Akbar's policies. Music and poetry were banned from the court. The vibrant imperial workshops that had produced masterpieces of painting and calligraphy fell silent. The full force of Islamic law, the Sharia, was to be the law of the land for Muslim and non-Muslim alike. He ordered the destruction of numerous Hindu temples, particularly those in regions hostile to his rule. The final symbolic blow came in 1679 when he reimposed the hated jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslims, which had been abolished by Akbar over a century earlier. The policy of Sulikul, peace for all, was officially dead. Was this the work of a single-minded religious zealot, a man on a divine mission to purify India?
That is part of the truth.
Aurangzeb was genuinely devout and saw the syncretic culture fostered by his great-grandfather as a corruption. But to ignore the cold political logic at play is to misunderstand the man. His bloody usurpation of the throne had left him isolated. He desperately needed to legitimize his rule, and his most natural allies were the conservative Islamic clergy, the ulama, whom he empowered and patronized. The jizya was not only a statement of Islamic supremacy, it was a desperately needed source of revenue to fund the ceaseless wars that would define his reign. The destruction of temples was not always random bigotry. It was often a calculated act of political punishment against rebellious Hindu chieftains and kingdoms. Religion and politics, as always, were inextricably linked, but policies have consequences. The empire Akbar had built rested on a delicate balance, a grand coalition of diverse groups.
Aurangzeb took a hammer to that balance.
The Rajputs, whose warrior clans had been the literal sword arm of the empire for a century, were alienated and driven into open rebellion. In the north, the Jats, a community of peasant farmers, rose up in a revolt that would simmer for decades. The most tragic and transformative consequence came in the Punjab. Aurangzeb summoned the 9th Sikh guru, Tegh Bahadur, to Delhi and demanded he convert to Islam. The guru steadfastly refused to abandon his faith. In 1675, Guru Tegh Bahadur was publicly beheaded in Delhi. This brutal act of martyrdom forever changed the Sikh faith. The Guru's son and successor, Gobind Singh, transformed the community from a peaceful, spiritual movement into the Khalsa, a fiercely militarized community of warrior saints bound by oath to resist Mughal tyranny. Aurangzeb, in his attempt to enforce orthodoxy, had created a new and formidable enemy. But all these rebellions would pale in comparison to the firestorm brewing in the south, in the rugged hills of the Deccan. His policies had lit fires of rebellion across the north. But this was nothing compared to the inferno that awaited him in the south. For decades, in the rugged hills and plateaus of the Deccan, a new power had been rising, the Marathas. Led by a brilliant and charismatic guerrilla leader named Shivaji Maharaj, they were waging a relentless war of independence. The Mughals derisively called him the Mountain Rat, a name that inadvertently paid tribute to his genius for hitting the slow, massive imperial armies where they were weakest and then vanishing back into the hills. In 1694, Shivaji had himself crowned as an independent sovereign, a Chhatrapati, a direct and defiant challenge to Aurangzeb's authority. In 1681, vowing to crush the Marathas and annex the last two independent sultanates of the Deccan, Bijapur and Golconda, Aurangzeb made the single most consequential and ultimately catastrophic decision of his reign. He moved his entire imperial court, the Grand Army, and the vast machinery of state south to the Deccan. He fully expected to return to Delhi in a few years, victorious. He would never see his capital again. He would spend the last 26 years of his life there, a prisoner of his own obsession. At first, he was brutally successful. He conquered Bijapur in 1686 and Golconda in 1687. In 1689, he captured Shivaji's son and successor, Sambhaji, and had him tortured and executed in the most gruesome manner.
On paper, it was total victory.
The Mughal Empire had reached its largest geographical extent, but in reality it was the beginning of the end. By destroying the established kingdoms of the south, he had removed all buffer states. By executing their king, he had ensured the Marathas would never negotiate. He had not extinguished the fire. He had merely scattered its embers across the entire Deccan, where it now became a people's war, with no center to attack and no army to defeat. The final 18 years of Aurangzeb's life were a grim, monotonous tragedy. The now aged emperor marched his colossal army endlessly from one mountain fortress to another, spending years besieging one fort, only to hear that another had been retaken by the Marathas behind him. It became a bleeding ulcer, constantly draining the lifeblood of the empire, its soldiers, its gold, and its morale. While the emperor was trapped in the south, the administration in the north began to crumble from neglect. The empire was rotting from its core. In the early days of 1707, at the age of 88, Aurangzeb finally died as he had lived for the last quarter century, in a military camp in the middle of the Deccan, far from the heart of his empire. His final letters to his sons are filled not with pride, but with a profound sense of failure and regret. "I came a stranger into this world, and a stranger I depart," he wrote. "I know nothing of myself, what I am, or for what I am destined. I have not done well by the country or its people. My years have gone by profitless. What, then, is the legacy of this colossal figure?" At his death, the Mughal Empire was larger than it had ever been, stretching across almost the entire subcontinent. He was, without doubt, a colossally capable, disciplined, and diligent ruler who never indulged in the luxuries of his predecessors. This was his merit. But this vast empire was a hollow shell. This was his sin. His relentless wars had bankrupted the treasury that had once seemed limitless. His army was a demoralized and broken force. His orthodox policies had shattered the social contract of trust and coalition built by Akbar, leaving behind a legacy of bitterness and revolt among Rajputs, Sikhs, Jats, and Marathas. Here is the ultimate paradox of Aurangzeb. The most powerful of the great Mughals was also the architect of its ruin. He was a man whose formidable strengths, his piety, his discipline, his unwavering will, when untempered by pragmatism and compromise, became the empire's fatal weaknesses. He tried to hold the empire together by forcing it into a rigid mold of his own making, and in doing so, he broke it. He left to his sons not a thriving state, but a vast, overstretched, bankrupt, and dying empire.